It's day 2 of voting.
Yeah.
The turnout has been exceptional. A few security issues in RBA, but is it smooth sailing by your assessment?
Yes, of course I'm saying this from Nairobi, but I had the opportunity yesterday to visit the polling center in Nakuru, Kenya, and I've also been following developments in Sudan, and one could say so far very peaceful. Of course, you've just mentioned some of the problems that were experienced in Unity State. But again, it seems that the security agents in southern Sudan particularly are able to contain the situation. So generally, I think it's going on quite smoothly.
Okay, let's talk about that security threat, because it does happen in a strategic part of the Sudan, in RBA, which is the most prolific oil-producing region, a contested area, and because of all these dynamics, it's a region that's supposed to hold a separate referendum at a later stage. If that situation is not contained, will it have bearing on southern Sudan and what's going on there?
Well, of course, there are fears. I mean, even if the referendum went on very well, as it is likely to be the case, the pending issues, and particularly the question of RBA, is one that people will want to watch very keenly. It is no longer very much contested in terms of boundaries, because the two parties agreed that they were going to uphold the decision of the international arbitration process in 2009, which demarcated new boundaries for RBA. So it's not quite the question of boundaries. I think the main question now in RBA is who will be allowed to vote in the RBA referendum whenever it is held, whether it's going to be both the Miseria communities as well as the Ngok Dinka, or is just going to be the Ngok Dinka as is stipulated in the CPA. So this is something that one could only say will be watched in the period after the referendum.
I mean, obviously the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005 makes provision for the various referenda that are to take place. But unresolved issues are questions about resource sharing and how the oil wealth is to be managed. To this point, southern Sudan has often accused northern Sudan of not being transparent about how much oil is produced, how much is being earned, and really questioning whether in a 50-50 revenue sharing agreement, southern Sudan is getting the correct allocation of funds. How's this issue to be resolved?
Well, you're right about that. The CPA says that after certain deductions, and of course you must bear in mind that the CPA also stipulates that 2% of the oil revenue is going to be retained in the state that is producing the oil. Now, after those deductions and the 2%, then what is left is to be shared on a 50-50 basis between the north and the south. As it is now, it is only the north that have the capacity to monitor the production of oil. And that is the reason, again, you are right there, that the south have continuously accused the north of not being honest or not being very transparent in this. But this might not necessarily go beyond the referendum because the provisions of the CPA are very clear that in the event that the south decides to secede, then, of course, the oil revenues accruing to the south will be those within the boundaries of the south. So it's quite straightforward there. But if the Sudan remains united, then oil sharing formula is going to be renegotiated. So I think this was anticipated at the time of writing of the CPA, and in the period after the referendum, it's quite clear what's going to happen with the sharing of oil revenue in the Sudan.
I mean, continuing on this tack, there is a huge concern that southern Sudan is lagging in terms of infrastructure, a huge deficit. Although the oil may exist in southern Sudan, the pipelines run to the north, and there's an urgent need for investment in this area to really kickstart the economy of southern Sudan. Any indication as to major infrastructure projects to be unveiled quickly?
Well, one cannot say for sure. I think the information that is available indicates that after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, international donor agencies and international donor countries met in Oslo, in Norway, and committed themselves to donating up to $4.5 billion for the reconstruction process in the south particularly. Now, After that, the World Bank set up what they called a multi-donor trust fund to manage these resources and the reconstruction process. Up to this time, about $525 million US have been spent out of that fund. And if you go to Juba, you can only see for yourself how much has been realized in terms of infrastructure development. So it seems the amount of money that will be required to build infrastructure and to reconstruct other sections of the economy is going to be quite huge, because if $525 million have done just what we see in Juba today, then the reconstruction budget is indeed very big.
Obviously, news that's dominating headlines today is reports that the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, has agreed to settle Sudan's debt of $38 billion contingent on a peaceful transfer of power if the South decides to secede. What do you make of these reports?
Well, I think I do not know why there's a lot of focus only on the debt, because to the best of my knowledge, there are a whole lot of other issues that need to be negotiated between the two parties, even if the referendum returned a separation as a result. And some of these, of course, include the citizenship, issues like ownership of property and so on. So one can only wait, because we are aware that by December last year, the African high-level panel on implementation in the Sudan, chaired by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, already started the process of bringing together the two sides to negotiate issues in the post-referendum period. And the debt and the sharing of the national debt is just one of them. There are probably, in my view, other more difficult ones. Well, it might be that Omar al-Bashir has committed himself to that, but I think complete negotiations over many post-referendum issues will be taking place after the referendum in details.
I mean, I think obviously the debt issue was a contentious one for both sides, because Southern Sudan felt that if they were to secede, they cannot be strangled by debt as they try to reconstruct and build a new country. Now, you've mentioned some of the other pressing challenges: citizenship, demarcation, boundaries within the state, investment prospects. What lessons can Southern Sudan draw from? And I think in recent history, the only other example that comes to my mind is Eritrea, that then broke away from Ethiopia in the last 20 years. What other areas can Southern Sudan learn from, and what are the fundamental issues it must focus on then?
Well, other than just the negotiations that are going on and the leadership being provided by the African Union's high-level panel on implementation in the Sudan, there is also a process, particularly around the debt apportionment, led by the World Bank and the IMF. And this also seeks to bring to Sudan knowledge and experience in similar situations in the past. You've mentioned Eritrea. Of course, one could go ahead and say, Namibia, for example. So there's information, there's data, there's resource. Hopefully the World Bank and the IMF particularly would make this available on the technical side, while the African Union leads the political negotiations between the two sides.
And finally, potential friends for Southern Sudan. We've seen the United States of America be very vocal about the secession, supporting the referendum process, urging the North to respect the process. All of these things, even Barack Obama saying that if Southern Sudan secedes, they will help Sudan in dealing with their debt arrears to the IMF and other Paris Club creditors. A skeptic could argue that America is trying to get its foot in, especially the oil sector, because under George W. Bush, there were major sanctions against U.S. companies operating in the Sudan. There have been lots of hostility, for instance, over the situation in Darfur. And this détente is probably a way of American business getting a foothold into Africa's third largest oil producer. Is that a fair assessment, or am I being very cynical?
Well, it's not easy to tell what the motivation of the United States is, whether it's for its own business or just in the interest of peace. Because again, as you know, the US is a leading global military and economic power, and security and peace in Africa, and particularly in the Sudan, is of interest to the US. Whether those are just guided by business one cannot tell. But of course, it must be noted that even America's own position in the Sudan only got consolidated recently, particularly, diplomatic statements and so on. One could say this became concrete only 6 months ago. Before then, there were instances when different envoys of the United States disagreed, sometimes, openly, on American policy in the Sudan. So it cannot be said that the U.S. interest and policy on the Sudan has been a constant or has remained the same or consistent. I think it's only in recent times that we are seeing a change. Whether that is because of U.S. interest in business or not is something that I do not want to comment about.